The Supreme Court tonight just cleared the way for the National Archives to send more than 700 Trump White House documents to the January 6th Select Committee. It is a significant defeat for the former president. We'll talk about the implications momentarily. But first, CNN's Jessica Schneider with what the High Court actually decided. So what exactly does this entail?
Well, you know, this entails that the Trump team can no longer block these documents, and the committee, Anderson, expecting the 700-plus documents to be handed over very soon from the National Archives. So the Supreme Court, they said in what was a fairly short order tonight that Trump and his legal team, they cannot block these records that they've actually managed to keep from the committee for several months. This is actually a decision that we've been waiting for from the Supreme Court since just before Christmas, December 23rd. And tonight, it was only Justice Clarence Thomas who publicly disagreed with the decision. Also of note, Justice Brett Kavanaugh, he wrote separately here to clearly state that this order, it doesn't settle the question of whether a current president's decision to assert or not assert executive privilege takes priority over a former president's assertion. That issue will actually be left for another day. But the court saying here in this particular case, since the lower courts essentially decided that Trump's arguments were just too weak to assert privilege, even if he had been sitting president, that means that Trump cannot block his records. So this is, as you mentioned, a significant win for the committee. It now means that they'll receive and review 700-plus documents. Anderson, this includes a plethora of documents, call logs, visitor logs from the White House on January 6th, a record of Trump's movements and meetings that day, plus some key records from Chief of Staff Mark Meadows, Press Secretary Kayleigh McEnany. That includes talking points and draft speeches. So the committee here will suddenly have a lot more information about Trump's actions and state of mind that day, Anderson, something that they've been trying to understand more about.
Yeah, well, we'll see what's actually in those documents, I guess, at some point. Jessica Schneider, I appreciate it. Thanks very much. Perspective now from CNN political analyst, New York Times Washington correspondent Maggie Haberman, also CNN chief legal analyst Jeffrey Toobin. Jeff, I mean, how significant is this? We don't really know the significance of exactly what is in these documents, but I'm wondering what you make of it.
Well, it's an extraordinary rebuke of the former president. First of all, this is just the back of his hand. It's just a one-paragraph opinion with only one dissent, all three Trump appointees voting with the majority. Plus, you remember when this was argued, there was a lot of controversy over who gets to exert executive privilege. Is it only the incumbent president, or can a former president assert executive privilege? The court said it doesn't matter, because even if Trump had been the president asserting executive privilege here, he still would have lost the case. So it is a thoroughgoing repudiation of his legal position, and in further years, this will strengthen Congress's hand in investigating the executive branch, even well into the future.
Were you surprised that Justice Clarence Thomas dissented?
Not at all. What surprised me is that there were not more of the conservatives who dissented. Clarence Thomas is the most right-wing member of this Supreme Court. He is the farthest from the center of the court, at least on the right side. And what surprised me is that Neil Gorsuch didn't dissent, because they are usually in tandem on almost every issue.
Maggie, do you have any sense from sources what information these documents are likely to contain? I mean, Jessica and I was talking about call logs, movements, but it's not like the former president, you know, is on email and TikTok and Twitter. Well, he was on Twitter, a lot, but you know, he's not somebody who communicates with devices directly.
No, not only, Anderson, does he not communicate directly in terms of, text or email, if he uses text in responses at all. I know he receives text, and that could be interesting to people, but he also uses aides' phones to make phone calls. He doesn't always use his own phones. He doesn't always use his own cell. He doesn't always use the White House phone into his office, what was his office. So it's not going to be that complete a picture. This has been very closely held about what is actually in these documents. I think that it might end up being that there's there's less there than people are hoping. But I agree with Jeffrey that what this means is it is not just a rebuke of the former president, but it's a rebuke of this approach of trying to slow everything down with this really broad-scale lack of cooperation with this committee, basically just saying we're not going to acknowledge subpoenas over and over and over by any number of people.
Maggie, I talked to somebody who had worked at the National Archives long ago, who said that things like Signal, all these encrypted apps, it's not clear that. And all this information has to be voluntarily turned over by White House staff to the National Archives. It's not like there's a, National Archives police who go up and are scooping up all these documents. It's really just up to Mark Meadows and all these people, I guess, to hand over their records. Is it, for all we know, they didn't?
Right. Look, Mark Meadows, I will say, I would put him in a separate category, Anderson, because he did turn over a bunch of documents before he then decided he wasn't cooperating with the committee right after he had published this tell-all book about his former boss. So he's in a different group, but he did turn over a bunch of things. However, you're right. A lot of this is the honor system. The White House is certainly not the only governmental entity I've ever covered where a lot of people use encrypted apps and try to keep their comms off of official lines. But this is certainly the most significant and highest office in the land, and we're talking about an event of national significance where there is just unlikely as much work has gone into this, the January 6th committee and the report they're planning on putting out. It's still not going to be a complete picture.
Jeff, obviously, go ahead.
Well, I just was going to say it's maybe worth mentioning that, we're all taking for granted that the Trump White House used all these sort of official communications through unofficial means. Hillary Clinton was not elected president of the United States because she used a personal email. But the Trump White House obviously felt that it was fine to use Signal and even more secretive means of communication than Hillary Clinton ever used.
So, Jeff, the legal problems that the former president faces, there's not just Washington, but in New York, the state's attorney general, Letitia James, is claiming in new court papers that the Trump organization, quote, used fraudulent or misleading asset valuations to obtain a host of economic benefits, including loans, insurance coverage, and tax deductions. Now, the former president has always denied any wrongdoing, and this idea that there were, multiple sets of books, and he would say one thing is to tax authorities and others to bankers. Where do you see the New York investigation going?
Well, this was a really extraordinary filing by Attorney General James. I mean, the scope of the lying, at least as she described it, was really breathtaking. And we're talking about differences of hundreds of millions of dollars in certain cases. Understating documents when you want to pay, understating valuations when you want to pay taxes, overstating them when you want to take tax deductions or when you want to get bank loans, including just sort of surreal lying about things like the size of his Trump Tower triplex. In certain circumstances, when it was helpful, he said it was 30,000 square feet. In other circumstances, he said it was 10,000 square feet. Now, you can argue about valuations of real estate, but the size of the apartment is the size of the apartment. I think there's real possibility for a prosecution here. This is both a civil investigation by the Attorney General of New York and a criminal investigation by the Manhattan District Attorney, but it's all the same facts. And, I think the former president has some real problems.
But Jeff, you're talking about even if there were charges to the Trump organization, isn't that a monetary fine?
Not necessarily. I mean, that's the civil case that Attorney General James could file. But the district attorney who was investigating the same thing could file criminal charges. Now, there are problems with this case. It's not clear that the banks relied on these figures. It's not clear that the banks lost any money. So what kind of fraud would it be if nobody lost money? But the false statements, at least if James are correct, could easily be the basis for a criminal investigation of the former president if, in fact, the facts are said.
Maggie, do you have any sense, based on folks you've talked to in the former president's orbit, do you have any sense of what the former president is more concerned about, the January 6th committee or prosecutors in New York? Or, is he concerned?
I mean, I think he's in a general state of concern whenever he is under investigation. My sense is that he is most focused on the ones in New York. As we know, there's January 6th committee. There are the New York investigations, and then there's the Georgia investigations. There's been not a ton of movement from Georgia. That may happen. We don't know. But New York has generally been where his focus is, in part because that relates to his business, that relates to where he was from, and it's also just the area he knows the best. On January 6th, so far, folks around him have taken note in my conversations with them that the Justice Department, with the exception of this, Steve Bannon and the criminal contempt on not cooperating with the subpoena and not responding to it, they've generally done very little, the Justice Department, and that's actually aggravated a number of Democrats. But that's something that the former president's circle is taking heart in.
Yeah.